Good evening, everyone. My name's Charles Godfrey. I'm the director of the Oxford Martin School, and the Oxford Martin School brings together groups to do interdisciplinary research within the university, and we're here through the generosity of James and Lillian Martin. It's an enormous pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, Lord Stern, Nick Stern, who has a very long history with Oxford. Nick is currently the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government at the LSE, and he chairs the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change there, as well as the India Observatory. I'm not going to start listing all the things Nick has done through a very long career. He's been at the World Bank, Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, part of the Prime Minister's Commission for Africa. But of course, he's famous for his work on climate change, and particularly the Stern Review. But Nick's going to be talking tonight about another passion of his, about development and a long series of studies in India, which is culminated in the book. So Nick, please come and tell us about your study.
Thank you very much, Charles, and I do feel close to the Martin School and was involved from actually before the beginning, before it started. And it's a great institution and adding so much in so many ways, including on climate and including on development. But I thought I just should give anybody who's come here to listen to climate change, I should give them a chance to leave now. That's not. You can ask me a question on climate at the end if you like, because nothing much has happened quite yet, but my goodness, it could over the next few decades. So this is a talk about development economics, but it's a talk about development economics through the eyes of one village. And I'll show you in a little while where the village is in UP. But essentially, it's asking what I think is the central question of development economics, which is not, in my view, asked centrally enough, which is how lives change. I mean, why do we study development? Because we're trying to understand how lives change. And if we're policy nerds, then having understood how lives change, we talk about policy to try to make those processes work better. I mean, sometimes we even talk about it before we've understood how lives change. But that's the challenge. That's what development economics is all about. And mostly, we don't have data that addresses that question directly. We have data which might be very valuable data, say in India, National Sample Survey data, and you'd have this cross-section survey running for India and done every year. But that doesn't tell you how a person's lives change. That tells you how different parts of the distribution covered in the sample look over time. But those aren't people. Those are bits of a cross-section. So what we're doing when we look at one village over a long period of time is to look at how lives change. And we don't have, as it were, my econometric friends talk about everything coming down to unexplained heterogeneity and having jokes about how soon unexplained heterogeneity it gets introduced into the discussion. But, we know who these people are. There's the people we know and families we know and circumstances we know. So we might not be able to explain what's happened, but we know what's involved and we know the characters at work. So it's not as if they are just some points deviating from some regression line. They're people with characteristics and histories. So that's what we're going to try to do. And what we want to try is to set that story of how lives change in the context of theories of development and theories of change, because that's what we bring as economists to the table. Now, if you're going to work in an Indian village, you're sort of part economist, part anthropologist, part sociologist, and you should be. And on the team, we had people who were genuinely directly skilled in that story. But we ourselves, of course, end up doing anthropological and sociological and political science in all this, because that matters too. Now, this book, How Lives Change, is joint with Himanshu, Professor Himanshu at JNU, Peter Lanjouw, Free University of Amsterdam, and myself. I'll tell you some of the history very soon. It kicked off here in Oxford with, I was here and in Essex, so it kicked off Oxford and Essex, where Christopher Bliss was then, and then, is Christopher here, by the way? Oh, well, I was hoping Christopher might make it, but never mind. And then I moved to Warwick and Christopher moved to Oxford, so it's had sort of deep Oxford roots from the beginning. But I'll go through how the surveys were put together and who was involved in what. But when we started in 1974, we had data, and we deliberately chose the village because, and I'll come back to that, because it had data going back to the 50s. So we've got one survey for every decade since independence, 7 surveys, not sample surveys, surveys. That's everybody. And it didn't start, as it were, when we went in 74-5, and I'll tell you how we chose the village, but Christopher and I were deliberately going to somewhere that had been studied before, so we had 3 surveys then. But then we said, oh, well, this is really very interesting, so we'll go back, and then Jean Drez got involved. And then it sort of became a longitudinal survey. But it wasn't designed, we didn't say in 1974 that we're going to be doing this 45 years later. I mean, rational expectation, that would have been an irrational expectation. Anyway, it didn't work like that. But it became like that. So by the time we got to the 80s, we knew we wanted to do the longitudinal stuff. But then, of course, we had to retrofit the other stuff, which was covering everybody. We had to retrofit and get the data in a form that was much more like, as it were, not quite panel, but that kind of structure. So basically, if you want to do this stuff, you've got to start young and live long. And this is key. You've got to find bright young people to work with you. So I'm much the oldest, and Peter, without being too personal, he's in his 50s, and then Himanshu is in his 30s, and we've got some people who are in their 20s, so that's what we hope the future of all this will look like. So that's the story of, in anyway, big sense. So that's the book. You can get it afterwards. And what I'm going to do is to take you through, it'll have to be pretty fast, but it will be the basic ideas we were trying to get after, which is theories of development, particularly, growth, distribution, the classical subjects from, Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and of course the role of institutions and behavior in that, also central to the classicists and Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. But the big ideas of development, but looking at them in a very, very micro way, but not losing touch of these big ideas. So I'll introduce those very briefly. I'll tell you about the Palanpur surveys and how they were put together. And then the guts of this is this bit here. So I'll try to spend at least half the time on the details of the quantitative work. And then I'll pull out what we've learned on all this. Now, I don't want to say this is the only way to do development economics. I'm deeply suspicious of anybody who says X is the only way to do development economics, and people like that. But I do think it's a way of doing development economics which actually, if you excuse the phrase, reaches parts that other peers can't reach. And because it focused right in on the data of how lives change. And if you want to have data on how lives change, you're following people over time. That's what it means. So I think it adds and interweaves with other ways, and it's complementary to different ways of looking at development. And I'll try to, at the end, try and bring that out still more, but I hope it's embodied in the stories that we tell here. So the stories that we have here, if you like, are a bit like the Kuznets and Lewis stories. These are people who were working very firmly in agriculture, and when we first started, dominated by agriculture, still in 74-5, but very much so in 57, 58. And then it's an economy where the activities change from that, and they get really after the 80s, more and more involved in the outside economy. So it's what you'd expect from economic history. It's what you'd expect from the stories of Kuznets and Lewis, and Kuznets and Lewis do have a helpful story to tell. But we'll argue that actually what we observe is very different from the story of Kuznets and Lewis in fundamentally important ways, even though it shares important aspects of similarity with it. So it will be structural, it will be institutional, it will be behavioral, but it will be embedded in a long-term story of growth with changing structure and asking about how structural change, growth and distribution move together. Obviously, institutions will be a very important part, and individual behavior within those institutions, of linking what happens to people to these big stories of development, and that the village study really does allow us to put them together. So those are the kinds of theories that we'll investigate, and we'll do it all the way from how agricultural markets work up to how people search and find these activities outside agriculture and what the nature of those activities are. We lots of stories about how agricultural institutional structures and market functionings change as the outside economy changes. So people will organize contracts in agriculture in rather different ways because they have moved out, because they've got liquidity, because they've got alternative opportunities. And the focus in this seminar will be on mobility and inequality. And we'll argue and try to show that there's actually quite a very interesting relationship between the two. And sometimes mobility will give you more equality, and sometimes mobility will give you more inequality, and it depends on the opportunity structures that are involved. And we'll see in Palanpur mobility giving you reduced inequality in the first part of the period and increased inequality in the second part. And how that happens is extremely important to this story. This slide is actually about what I'm not going to talk about very much, but I would be really unhappy if you thought the book was only about what I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about the mobility and inequality stories of the book, but whole parts of it about, if you like, the more society, human development parts of the story, they are very important. In each of the books that we've done, this is the third book, we have speculated about the future. So every 20 years we publish a book and speculate about the future of Palanpur, and sometimes we got it right and sometimes we got it wrong. So I'll illustrate a little bit of that. So I wanted to emphasize that I might be giving, as it were, a broad brush picture, but it's a broad brush picture of only about half the book. It's very, I wanted to remind you what it's got that I'm not, what it has that I'm not talking about. Now, some of you will be aware that there are over 600,000 villages in India. So what do you learn from studying just one of them? Well, it's a fair question. It occurred to us from the beginning, obviously. And there are various ways of looking at that. And the choice of village does matter. Of course, you don't want to go to somewhere that's very peculiar. But what we did is we looked at surrounding villages. We used to go for walks and look around and collect data from surrounding villages. We compare the village with the National Sample Survey data and see if the things that are happening there are not dissimilar from what's happening in the National Sample Survey. We look at other village studies, and there is a rich tradition in India of village studies, and Barbara here is a good example of that, and I'm sure there are others in the audience too. And then we actually, a few years ago, got together at a conference in JNU on longitudinal village studies. So we've done our best to situate this village study in the context of the economy, the context of how that's changing, the context of UP, the context of surrounding villages, and relate it to other village studies, mostly from India, but not only from India. So very quickly, here's the story. Why did we go there in the first place? Well, I've already said we wanted somewhere that had been studied previously, in particular because we were looking at the Green Revolution when we went in 74-5. We wanted to be able to live independently of a caste or household, because if you live with one particular group, then you get associated with their interests. It shouldn't be too close or too far from Delhi. When we went there in 74, nobody in the village had ever been to Delhi, so it was far enough. So you could get there in 5 or 6 hours. Lots of the work in our first study was around green revolution, so wheat was critical, and there was lots of theory around tenancy, so that was a very important part. We wanted to have a village where tenancy was important, and nothing particularly unusual. I mean, you might get a village that's dominated by silversmithing or brass making or pottery or something, and then it would be rather different in its economic construct. So Palanpur wasn't like that. Of course, agriculture goes up and down, and of the years we're talking about here, 4 were reasonably okay, and 3 were bad, and you have to remember that when you're looking at the data over time. That's where it is. It's the great sort of big sort of centres of the Green Revolution were Haryana, Punjab, and parts of West UP, particularly places like Muzaffarnagar and so on. So what we are here is up the east end of those strong agricultural areas, and it's not a very people were saying, why have you gone there? Because it's not a very advanced village. Our reaction, of course, is that's fine, because we don't want it to be particularly peculiar. And we tried not to do anything that was developmental. So we didn't come there with policies and changes and so on. And on the whole, we succeeded. Now, how many of you here have ever met Clive Bell? 2 of you? 3 of you? Yeah, well, so the rest of you I'll have to explain. When we went in 73-4, when Christopher and I were putting these ideas together, see the wonderful Scarlett Epstein in Sussex, and there was Clive and Michael Lipton there as well. And Clive had just got back from some work he'd been doing in Bihar. So he said, Clive, have you got any tips? You're going to live in a village, and he said, I've tried a little bit on his accent, I'm not very good at it, but he said, the secret, he said, Nick, the secret is to convince them that you are mad, but harmless. And if you knew Clive, you would, he did it very well. And on the whole, we, I think, managed. But so the point was that we didn't do harm, we didn't bring them development, we were just observers. And after a bit, they thought, well, we were a bit odd, and why, and never mind. And after a very long period of time, no harm came, yeah? And nobody's taken any special policy interest in the village, and that's good. So that's roughly where it was. So earlier books, well, as I said, there's the Bliss and Stern volume, and then Jean Drèze led the charge in 83, 84 with Naresh Sharma, and we eventually put together an edited volume that came out in 98. We seem to have long gaps between doing the work and publishing. So each time what we've done is that when it got sufficiently long, we did another quick survey to pick up before we published. So there was one in 93. And then the biggest, Jean lived there for, we were there for about 8 months. Jean was there for about 15 months. And then Himanshu was there for about 2 years, essentially. The team were living in the village 2008-10. And then we did a quick survey in 2015. By the time we got to 2015, of course, you had iPads, tablets, and so on, and it was much easier to do a quick survey than had been done before. Now, you go to a household, you knew which household you were going to. You actually knew how old they were. You didn't have to ask them because you got the data from before. So the 2015 quick survey was pretty good. So that's it. Now, thought you might have a look at pictures. You will understand clearly who the person on the left-hand side. This is the point that you say in unison, my word, you haven't changed. But that was 1982 on the publication of the first book, and you can tell it's got a green cover. That's the Indian version. It was red cover in the UK. And this is the team now. This is Himanshu, that's Peter. Peter joined as a graduate student at the LSE in 86, myself. And this is the gentleman, Dinesh, who was in charge of the team. And you can see these are all male, and at least there's some females in this, and that makes, of course, a big difference to who you can talk to and what questions you can ask. This is a comparison, this is only across 20 years, huge difference between mud and brick, and having drains that work and drains that sort of run down the centre. So this is a village that's changing. This is a picture from 1983. Earlier pictures, kids are being taught outside, they're being taught inside. Now, of course, that doesn't tell you about the quality of the teaching, but the quality of the school has certainly gone up. This is a village compound, entirely unmechanised in 74, and then you've got a mechanical mentha oil press. Mentha is mint, essentially, so you're pressing mint to get mint oil. So you can see there's really substantial change there. But Palanpur, don't get me wrong, Palanpur is still a very poor village by Indian standards. Maybe a third of the income per capita of India as a whole. So let's go into quickly what has happened. Well, very roughly speaking, the income per capita has grown around 2%. That was quite lots and lots of fluctuations because this is agriculture. But roughly similar to India in the first part of the period. When I say first part and second part, I'm talking really about the first 30 years and the second 30 years. First part of the period, very roughly mid-50s to mid-80s. Second part of the period, roughly speaking, mid-80s till now. And the first part of the period saw the intensification of agriculture, including the Green Revolution. Intensification of agriculture means particularly irrigation, double cropping. And then the second part of the period saw much greater involvement in outside activities. And of course, that was a period where the growth rate in India was really picking up, whereas the growth rate in Palanpur still went on about 2% per annum, with lots and lots of fluctuations. But asset ownership has changed. More than half the households will have a mobile phone, quite a lot of motorbikes, whereas just a few bikes when we began to be there. Agriculture has become much more mechanised. The irrigation, when we were there first, was mostly by Persian wheels, where you drive a draft animal, bullock, usually round and round and there's a chain of buckets, and you lift the buckets, and that's the Persian wheel. Now, all that has changed now to either diesel pumping sets or electric pumping sets. You saw the Mentha oil crusher, so the mechanisation has been very strong. The structure of the village was a very important part of the story. One of the two dominant castes in terms of wealth, such as it was, were the Thakurs at the top, the warrior or Kshatriya caste, and then there were the Muraus, or part of the Shudra group, who were cultivators. And those were the two top castes in the village. And the Muraus, during the time of the Green Revolution, the intensification of agriculture, were actually rising and doing better. And they were actually following their skills, or putting their skills and cultures to work. But later on, they were a bit slower in adjusting to these outside job opportunities. But always remember that it was tempting in India to put everything down to caste, and it does matter. It does matter. But at the same time, everywhere you look, the within-group variation is bigger than the across-group variation, so it's important to bear that in mind. And I'll stress at a number of points the importance of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is spotting an opportunity, well, in my language anyway, I hope it's all right in your language. Entrepreneurship is spotting an opportunity and then encountering a risk or taking on board a risk in order to pursue that opportunity. And so much of what the decisions about people's lives in developing countries, more than developing countries, are about that kind of issue. And some of the very lowest groups, in this case the Telis, who were part of the biggest Muslim group in the village, were right down at the bottom. It turned out that just one or two of them were more entrepreneurial than the rest, and they took their whole group up with them, and they moved right up the distribution. And the insight of Kuznets and Deng Xiaoping is quite important. Some people get richer before others. And some of those who get richer before others are the people who spot the opportunities and take them. Now you can and then you go on to the question is, well, why them? Why not somebody else? And we can discuss that, and we've got a few ideas. But it's very important to recognise that a lot of the mobility and the change in inequality is about exactly that. Education and health, it's moved along, but really is still pretty, public services are still pretty poor. The opportunities for women, and finally the education, opportunities for women are still very restricted, but finally in the last 10 years or so, the girls have started to go to school. So we can look ahead and ask ourselves, what difference will that make? Zamindari abolition, the zamindars were the kind of tax landowners under the Mughals and then the British, and they essentially owned the land. And with zamindari abolition, you got essentially land moving to the tiller. It worked in different ways in different parts of India, but in this part of India it worked quite well. And that meant that people would start investing in their land. So zamindari abolition in the early 50s, and that made a big difference to investing in irrigation and so to double cropping. Institutions matter. But as we'll see, institutions are endogenous. There's institutions determine outcomes, outcomes determine institutions. And the great enthusiasm in economic development for finding exogenous institutions and trying to explain everything by those is, in my view, not always helpful. Let me put it that way. So population is moved up in the time, a bit over doubled. Households gone up, number of households gone up too, and so on. The male-female ratio has started to move up a bit. I don't know where to get too optimistic about that, but we can come back to that if you like. This is, if you just look, say, at the Gini coefficient, there you can see it's sort of flattish and then gone down and then started to go up again. And that's a very important part of what we try to explain, and very quickly to give you the answer to that. During the early stages of the expansion of agriculture and double cropping, a few people were doing double cropping and had irrigated land. And in the period really from covering the 60s and 70s, irrigation and double cropping spread right across the village. So people were picking up the opportunities, seeing what was possible, encouraged by zamindari abolition and the greater security of tenure on the land. They were investing. So that process had an important equalizing element to it. You were catching up. There were these few guys originally who had irrigation and wells, and then during that 20 years or so, it moved to everybody doing double cropping. So it was an important, as it were, the entrepreneurship of taking the risk and investing in these new things. You felt more secure, of course, as you saw more people having done it, but that was equalizing. But when we got to the mid-80s, very few people had outside jobs. So the people who moved more quickly in outside jobs were people who were taking these opportunities. It's a slightly Kuznets sort of story. We don't call it the Kuznets story, we call it the Kuznets insight and the Deng Xiaoping insight, because the process at work, and I'll emphasize this, had very important differences from the Kuznets-Lewis kinds of processes. But it was the basic insight that some people get richer before others, which is attributed to Deng Xiaoping, but I'm sure goes back into time immemorial. But so that was the reason that you got inequality rising in the second half of the period. So entrepreneurship, mobility, taking opportunities can be equalizing in the case of the spread rapidly of irrigation and double cropping, but it can be bringing with it inequality in the case of people moving out into new opportunities. And it depends on the structure of the opportunities and how it works. So mobility really can go one way or the other, and you have to look at the structure of the economy and the nature of the opportunities that are being taken to find out which way it will go. Of course, wheat yields went up very strongly over the period, but lots of ups and downs. Agriculture, you can see, I'll have to go very quickly here because I want to spend a bit of time on the poverty, mobility, inequality story. So you can see wheat, paddy, bajra is a coarse grain. Those productivities, output per acre, per hectare going up pretty strongly, but with the fluctuations you'd expect. Cropping intensity, the number of crops you take from a particular piece of land, that goes up with irrigation. Mechanization has gone up strongly. The green is the pumping set, and you can see that the Persian wheels are virtually gone now. The pink was the Persian wheels. They were still going up when we came, but before long they turned down, being replaced by pumping sets, mostly diesel, now increasingly electric. The electric was delayed by two things. One is the electricity is extremely unreliable, and the second is people nick the wires, so that set back. Now you can see mechanization has really been a big part of this story, but what we're starting to do now is to see that where mechanization along with irrigation could have come with increased labour, now it's come with decreased labour, and that labour is being released to work outside the village. The tenancy patterns, I haven't got time, but we've got a couple of chapters on the agricultural side in the book. But sharecropping, Bataille is a 50-50 share, and that was absolutely the dominant form of tenancy when we were first there. And that has started to change now. It's still close to half, but it's changed from nearly everybody doing share tenancy if they rented out land or rented in land at a 50-50 rate to Peshki and Chautai. Chautai is a fourth, it's what the word means. I mean, it's a fourth of the, so it's a little bit like labour. So you hire somebody to work with you and you pay that person or that family a quarter of the output. So they take some significant risk and they have some significant incentive because it's a share. So it's kind of a share tenancy, but it's a share tenancy leaning towards a labour contract of hiring. And Peshki is cash rent. And essentially it was very little Peshki when we were there first, and that started to increase quite a lot now. And the reason is that if you've got activity outside the village, you haven't really got the time to do the supervision associated with a sharecropping contract. And all sharecropping contracts, if you get half and the tenant gets half, you're there and looking because you have a great incentive to make sure the tenant's working well and getting on with it. But with, in this case, as people take more outside jobs, the cash rent goes down. And you get less from cash renting than you do from sharecropping. But you're putting in less of your own time to supervise this story. So this is an example of where the institutional structures, the nature of the key contracts in the village are changing as outside opportunities change. There's an important example of what I mean by institutions being endogenous. At the same time, there's increasing emphasis on renting out your land within caste. Because, if you're renting out your land and you're not doing much supervision, people can make a mess of your land. They can just sort of run down the capital in the land. But, if you rent to people at least people within the caste group, then there's reason to trust, because they're within caste sanctions like ostracism and so on that can be invoked. So it's interesting that as Peshki goes up, it seems there's an intensity of the increasing intensity of the preference to rent out within caste. So these are the kinds of ideas, what I mean by the institutions and the behaviour and the technology and the outside opportunities, all weaving their stories together to give you the outcomes that you see. So I'll try to spend most of the rest on the story of poverty and inequality. Now, this is not a very elegant word, but pluriactivity. And this is where I want to really emphasise the difference between what we're seeing and a Kuznets or Lewis-like process. In a Kuznets or Lewis-like process, the reserve army from the backward sector moves off into the more formal sector, which is capitalistic. So in the Lewis story, you have a backward sector without much capital. It's not capitalistic in the sense of not much capital, not capitalistic in the sense of factors being allocated through competitive markets. And they move out of that into a more formal sector where there's a fixed wage, at least in the early part of the story, whilst the reserve army is very big. And that sector is capitalistic in the sense it maximizes profits and it uses capital. And that very crudely is the story. If you like, when people talk about creating jobs, it's not language I like very much, but you've got a picture there about a formal sector which expands. Well, the formal sector is not terribly important in India quantitatively in terms of the overall activity. It probably will be down the track, but not so much activity is like that. And what happens then is people commute to take jobs. And you can get to Moradabad in about just over an hour. You can get to Chandosi in about 25 minutes, depending on the means of transport. There are trains and there are bicycles and now increasingly motorbikes. And you go far enough, there's a bus. Even auto rickshaws finally coming to the village because the road has been improved. So there are various ways of doing it. And with the advent of the mobile phone, you've got much more information about the job opportunities at the other end. So this is a commuting story. And people do a mixture of activities. They don't give up agriculture within the family. So it's very important that that picture of changing activity is at the centre stage in thinking about what's going on here. And that's very different from the Kuznets-Lewis story. So that's the Flurry activity. You can see the rise here in non-farm income. Non-cultivation income has gone up too. Non-cultivation farm income means renting out your tractor. Now, when you had bullocks, you couldn't rent them out because it was demeaning if you rent them out, because you wouldn't just say, oh yeah, borrow my bullocks for a day. I mean, people would mistreat it, they wouldn't look after them properly. So you'd have to accompany your bullocks. But if you accompanied your bullocks, you would be in the demeaning position of working for somebody of a lower caste, and you wouldn't do that. So if you were lower caste and wanted to lease in, you had to have the bullocks. And if you had the bullocks, you'd use them mostly on your own land. So, because there wasn't a market for the reasons I described. But if you've got a tractor, you're a big guy sitting on top of the tractor, where you can rent the tractor out. And they do in the market for tractor. There are far too many tractors in Palanpur. I mean, they're sort of status symbol. And I could live in a village in Sussex in the UK. There are many more tractors in Palanpur than there are in... So I mean, it's very inefficient. But they are partly status symbols. But the point here is you can rent ploughing services. And if you've got a bit of liquidity, you can rent ploughing services. So if you've got a job outside, where previously, only a bit of the time, where previously you couldn't have rented inland, now you can, because you've got a bit of liquidity and you can rent in the tractor services. So you can see, again, outside opportunities and social custom and technology interacting to give you the outcomes. That non-farm income line, which has gone up strongly, where was that non-farm income? That one. If you look there, think of that as renting out machinery, pumping sets, tractors, and so on. So you can see if you put those two together, even in 2008-9, you got something close to 60% of the income is not from your farm. That would be way over 2/3 now, way over 2/3. Whereas you can see that cultivation income back there, and livestock income together, if you put those two together, they were completely dominant as sources of income. So you can see how the lives have changed in this sense. So that's the red is the non-farm employment going up, and this occupation patterns you can see in a similar way. Casual labour, non-farm has gone right up here. You can see how strongly that has risen. And it's not very nice work. This is moving bags around in the rail yard in Moradabad. This is making bricks I don't know if you've ever seen bricks being made in India. It's a truly horrible job. And, you're making the mud pies and then you're walking around on hot stuff and the dust is everywhere. But the point is that agricultural labour is not very nice either. This kind of job, even though it's probably more dangerous than agricultural labour, is much more regular and pays higher wages. And a lot of it comes when agricultural work isn't available. So you can see how this works. Different people differently. Now look at the tuckers at the top end of this story here. And strongly, the red is the cultivation and livestock. Early on, right up there, dominating. And you can see how far that has fallen. If you look at the Jattabs, they're leather workers right at the bottom of the pile. Obviously, dealing with carcasses and leather makes you an untouchable Dalit in that sense, language now. Although, of course, they don't do that anymore, but that was the ancient occupation of that group. And you can see casual non-farm, the orange or yellowy thing here, has moved right up. A lot of that's the brick kilns and unskilled manual work of various kinds. So for them, it's changed very rapidly too. But for the Maraus, the cultivating caste, that red bar, which is the cultivation and livestock, has fallen less fast than for the other groups. So you can see it's a very different story now. How is all this, and I've already given you a bit of this story about the different experience of different castes and so on, and the importance of the early period of the expansion of irrigation and the later period with the outside jobs. And I've spoken mostly of income, but we were really interested in other measures of people's social status, wealth, and so on. So one thing we did was the observed means. So that means, the means is not a very helpful word because it means so many things. But the observed means your means of buying things, that sort of means, yeah? And it's not logical positivism or anything like that. So how well did people seem? How well off did they seem in terms of the quality of their house? So how much they were educated and so on. So what we did is 2 or 3 of us, I didn't do it personally, but first done by Jean Drez and Naresh Sama, they, in 83, looked at the households and looked at them individually and ranked them in terms of those kinds of asset ownerships, how they lived and so on. And that was what observed means was. And we had asset scores made up of, did they have tables or chairs or radios or cycles or pumping sets and draft animals and so on. Those kinds of assets, more recently mobile phones and motorbikes. But you can see that if you look at this, I keep pressing, I kept meaning to have the, if you look at this little group down here, you've got quite decent correlations. Now, this is participatory rural appraisal. We got a group in to have a look at that. And this is for the year 2008-9. We've got observed means for earlier years, but we've got the participatory rural appraisal. So that's an absolute external group, and they, on the whole, ask members of the community to tell them how well off Blogs is. So each one is looking at the others. So you can see that these, which are kind of wealth status measures, and they're genuinely coming from different sources. Yeah? One is judgment, one is asset ownership, a little bit of overlap there, but the PRA is completely different people, and it's people ranking other people. But they come in quite close. But look at the relationship between consumption and income and these other things. It's much less. So our good old concept of transitory income is an important concept. And I suspect that consumption is just hard to measure too. It's not just transitory, it's also mismeasurement. be deeply suspicious of income and consumption behaviour, even though you have to even though you have to use them. Not saying don't use them, but give them a smell test and look very carefully. And I'm deeply suspicious of sample surveys that go in, spend a couple of days in a village and move on out, having spent 2 or 3 hours with each household with a questionnaire. I honestly don't know what those data are worth. We spent so much time with everybody. Eventually we knew who was cultivating what land because we watched it. We went and looked at it. We knew, we could see. But if you compare that with the very early data that you'd get about which was your land and what you were cultivating, it's a very big difference. So we've become, as well as, of course, the conceptual difference between the flow and the stock variable, which is extremely important in this context, there's also a quality of data variable, quality of data issue that matters a lot here. So this is the story of, I've alluded to before, inequality going sort of stable-ish and then down and then up. I've already given you the reason as to why we think that happened in terms of catch-up, mobility and catch-up in the early period, and actually a more sort of early stage, Kuznets-like story, not process story, in the later stages. If you see how these things change, we did have observed means in 1983, and you can see that the Jatubs were down the bottom end and the Morales up the top end. If you go on to 2008-9, you can see there's a real spreading out there. The Jatubs are spread across the distribution, the Morales are spread across the distribution. That's another readout on that process I described as the Morales being a bit late in the day in looking at the outside job opportunities. This is the story now of intergenerational mobility. Remember we've been there long enough. We can do father, son, grandson. Right? We can do it right across. We can do 2 lots of father, son. You have to excuse us for doing father, son, because the disadvantaged position of women in these communities means that it's quite difficult to know and describe their assets and their ownership in the way that you can do for the male. But you can see here that you've got what they call the great Gatsby curve, in the sense that you've got this positive slope here with it's a story of more inequality leading to less mobility. And because this is a very simple relationship of log of log of son's income on logs of father's income. You get coefficients of 0.3 or 0.4, much as Tony Atkinson did in his York study. But the strength of that coefficient seems to have been moving up along with the rise in inequality. So what you've got then is quite strong mobility if you look at the way in which the Markov matrices have shifted over time. So you've got, looks like some increase in mobility, but what you've got, if you look intergenerationally, the coefficient in log son's income on log father's income has gone up. It's interesting, if you want to know whether 0.3 or 0.4 is a big coefficient or a small coefficient, it's roughly the same as Tony Atkinson got on height of son, on height of father. So 0.3 or 0.4 is probably quite a strong, not hugely strong, but quite a strong coefficient. So there's an interesting story here. As these opportunities come into the system, there's lots and lots of variation of who takes those opportunities. But nevertheless, there's some advantage in taking these new opportunities in having a richer father. And that's the kind of story that, richer, nobody's rich in this context. So that's as you were, this sort of interesting difference. I've talked about the rise of the Jatubs and the decline of the Morales, but this last point here, always remember within group inequality. That's very powerful too. Now, I emphasize that we know these people and that there is always a personal story. And why do people go up? Well, they see opportunities and they take them and they succeed. Why do people go down? Well, I mean, you just have to read Dickens and Balzac to find out why people go down. Sometimes it's bad luck. Illness, of course, a very important part of that. Sometimes you get killed. I mean, I can describe the different sorts of murders you get, but there are quite a lot of murders in Palanpur. So there's violence or sickness. I mean, sickness more important quantitatively than violence. There's bad luck. If you've taken out heavy loans and you have a bad harvest or two, then you can lose your land that way and go down. So there's sickness, bad harvest, particularly if you're leveraged, and that can take you down. And there's dissipation, drinking and gambling. I mean, go and look at the history of any country house in the UK and find out how they went down. Drinking, gambling, consorting, all sorts of things going on. And those are roots down, as well as sickness and bad luck. So we tell some of those stories. I've already mentioned the Telly household here that started off working in a motorcycle maintenance. That this is in the 60s, so Zen and the art of motorcycle. But he started working on, and then he learnt the skills. He bought some of his own equipment, and he started hiring members of his own cast, and he built up that way. And he's done pretty well. And so the Tellys have really moved up the story. The Catchups have moved up the story with more unskilled manual work, not quite as dramatically, but the move up of the Tellys has been very impressive. So let me conclude with, and just spend 5 minutes or so on the lessons. But I've tried to draw out the lessons as we go, so these won't be of any surprise to you. The Kuznets insight, in the second part of the period, 80s, 30 years onwards from the 80s, this story of moving into different activities, the Kuznets insight, if you like, is important. But the process is not the Kuznets-Lewis process. Actually, not the process that Deng Xiaoping had, it seems, in his head. But the insight, some people acting quicker than others and getting rich before others, is important in understanding. But the nature of it, it's pluriactivity, it's commuting versus migration. It's investment in agriculture to release labour, which is an important part of this story. The way in which the institutions have functioned and changed, and the markets have changed within the village have all been part of that story. But basically, informal is normal. And this doesn't sort of fit neatly under creating jobs story development. It fits under creating opportunities stories, but those opportunities are of the kind where people take a bit. It's mostly informal, mostly piece rates in terms of payment and so on. And that, I think, will be a story of India's development for quite a long way to come. I mean, eventually it'll get more formal, but it's not that as the driver of development. I don't see in the next 10 or 15 years. So when we're thinking about development, we should be thinking not about job creation. We should be thinking of how opportunities rise, how the opportunities grow, who understands these opportunities, what risks and actions they have to take those opportunities, how it happens. That's the story of people's incomes going up, where the way I would try to express it. Agriculture, well, again, I haven't got time to focus on that, but this is a story of agriculture where markets are fairly competitive, but the key land market has very powerful institutional characteristics in terms of sharecropping to manage risk and incentives, but that changing over time under the pressures of outside opportunities and changing ability to supervise and so on. But we've still not found any difference between productivity on sharecropping land and productivity on own cultivated land. That was a very ancient debate as to quotes whether sharecropping was efficient. Not even well posed actually in that sentence, but people thought that because of the disincentives of sharecropping, output per acre might be smaller on sharecropped land than on owned land. We've never found any difference at any stage, for the reason that Marshall pointed out immediately. He raised the question of the possibility of disincentives from only getting half the marginal product. He said immediately, because of that, the landowner would be constantly having to supervise and work with. It wasn't that Marshall didn't see it, Marshall did see it, and it's in the data that we've never found any difference between output per acre on sharecropped and owned cultivated land. So I've told you the story of inequality, the reasons for going up and down, and this fascinating story about how the relationship between mobility and inequality depends on the nature of the opportunities and how they're developing, and where you are on the timescale of a change from one kind of thing to another kind of thing. Institutions and behaviour. I've emphasised the importance of the endogeneity of institutional structures. I remember one wonderful conversation where we sat down with a Catchup community who just achieved, with a bit of collective bargaining in the village, an increase in the agricultural wage in the village, because they were the dominant group in agricultural labour. And we said, well, look, that's pretty good. How did you manage that? And they were feeling fairly chuffed with themselves. And they said, well, we stood together, and the reason we were able to stand together so strongly was because we were earning money outside, and they had to beat that. And so their bargaining position went up. Strength of their bargaining position went up because of the outside opportunities. And I've emphasised how institutions, in terms of the structure of the whole land market, has changed as a result of the opportunities outside and the move to cash rents, and then within cash rents, the move to, or the strengthening of the desire to rent out within caste. The society, well, Palanpur society has changed really less fast, it seems, than other places. It's only in the last 10 years or so that the girls have started to go to school. It's really very recent. Education has not played much of a role in the story of employment. Just a few outside jobs it's been relevant, but this story of people getting involved outside the village has not got anything to do with education. I mean, if you're moving bags around in the rail yard in Palanpur, if your whole family and Catchup family is involved in brick making, you don't need any education for that. So education and employment, except for just a few jobs, has not been of any great importance. But this is one of our speculations for the future, is because education has risen, particularly for women, that education is going to play a much stronger role in the village in the next 20 years. But beware, because that's what we said 20 years ago. And I think we might be right this time. If you go on saying the same thing, this is the opposite of Einstein. If you go on doing the same thing, expecting a different result, he called that insanity. But actually, if you go on predicting the same thing and the world around you is changing, it might become right. And anyway, I do think that education is starting to play a role. It will likely play a role in commuting changing to migration. I think some of the younger generation will leave the village, and they'll leave the village better armed if they've got some education. So not much of a role up to now, but we do think that that's changing, and that's one of the things we forecast. Politics in Palanpur is very unassertive. If you're in Kerala and the teacher doesn't show up to school, you know where the teacher lives. You go down there. You say, hoi, come, what's going on? And people act together in a strong way. That doesn't happen in Palanpur. So it's a very interesting question. I expect quite a deep question as to why local politics is stronger in asserting rights and insisting on public sector delivery. Public sector delivery in terms of health and education is terrible. But we know there are some parts of India where people insist much more strongly than they do in Palanpur. So it's quite interesting. And we've got a few ideas, but it's not fully baked, and it will be very interesting to see how that develops, particularly now with the rise of the mobile phone. At the moment, they're saying, why does Modi keep sending me text messages during elections? But I mean, there may well be something richer than that in understanding why it is that other people are getting results by insisting, and that might increase the insisting in Palanpur. That's quite an open question. So this is the last part of what I wanted to say, and I won't go through it in detail, but I hope it's clear that the conclusions we've drawn and the stories we've told and the data we've used couldn't really have been told in the way we did tell them without that detail of the village in terms of its institutions and its structure and knowing how, or not knowing's too strong, having some understanding of how institutions and behaviour get to be what they are. And secondly, we couldn't have told the kind of stories we've told without the full survey each time, following it all the way through. But I will finish with one last prediction. There will be more Palanpur studies, and I intend to be around, if it be the will of God, in 20 years' time for the next one, or at least the people I'm working with will be. Thank you very much.
Let me thank Nick for a really fascinating lecture. We now have time for questions. Can I remind you that we will be, we're streaming the lecture, so do remember that what you say will go out.
And did the books turn up outside? Are there books outside?
And we'll have an opportunity.
Oh, they're at the back, I can see them.
We'll have an opportunity for a glass of wine at 6:30 and to get books signed and things. First question in the front, Ian.
Thanks, Nick, for that absolutely...
could you wait for the microphone? Sorry.
My voice is a bit... Thanks for that fascinating insight. You've talked about Palanpur so many times over the decades I've known you, but I've never heard this comprehensive thing. Two questions, really. The one is, maybe I'm reading what you're saying wrong, but an almost depressing insight that public policy doesn't seem to make much difference to Palanpur. How did changes in government policies on health, education, roads, energy, credit, extension offices, and all the other dozens of things that the Indian government and the UP government was doing over this time impact on the village, or didn't it impact on it? And the second, which I find remarkable too, is the fact that you managed over 4 decades to convince people that you're all mad and not to be taken seriously. The fact that such great economists were studying this village and had such great data, and that you chose the village because it already had decades of data, didn't that lead to any insights which led either the village elders or provincial governments, whoever makes decisions, to change their policies and do things in a better way?
Thanks, Ian. The impact of policy, it's been weak in Palanpur, but it's not been absent. I mean, Zamindari abolition, I emphasise Zamindari abolition quite strongly. And that was the 50s. And it really did matter. It really did. And the arrival of new varieties of seed, it came in India really initially from the research stations, and then it started to spread. There was no research station anywhere near Palanpur, but you have to give credit. That's how it came into the system. Those are two important things. Some subsidised loans for the pumping sets, that played a part, but not everybody went that route to get their pumping set. It was a good idea to have a pumping set, and one way or the other you got one, but some of the subsidised loans helped. I drew attention in the pictures to the difference between the brick lanes in the village, having replaced the mud lanes, and then the drains going on down the side and operating better rather than down the middle, and with open defecation and animals moving up and down. and the rain, you can imagine what it was like when they were all mud. So those things have come about in part. Some of the money from the employment guarantee scheme was used to brick over the village. So some things, yes, and they're not trivial, but they've worked so much better in other parts of India than they did in Palanpur. And so sometimes, because the schools don't function well, and the medics don't function well, and people make off with the pradhan, the head man, made off with the money for free school meals. So you can get pessimistic about policy, but I didn't mean to say that its effect was absent. It's not absent, and the examples I gave are not trivial examples. They could have been so much better, but they're not trivial examples. The reaction of the villagers, I think the gap of a decade probably helps. It's not as if we're living on top of them the whole time. But we couldn't, we were sensitive, obviously, to, we'd heard about observers changing things, an insight that wasn't absent from our thoughts from day one. But it didn't seem to, we can't see any effect. Now, so what's the counterfactual? But and the local people didn't local powers that be in the block development office and so on didn't particularly want to get involved in any way. So it didn't happen. I mean, maybe we had a bit of luck, but the outside people didn't. Right at the beginning, and Surya may be the only one who remembers him, but the wonderful Lavraj Kumar, and Lavi, who, Lavi was one of the greatest civil servants I've ever seen, but he knew how systems work and he knew how to make them work. He gave us a little letter to the district commissioner in Muradabad district, and essentially it said, "Good guys, leave them alone." Now, that was in 74-5, and sadly Lavi died, not, in the middle of all this. But, so in the initial period, I think we were helped by that. But I suspect the 10-year gap does help, as you sort of half forgotten by the time you get back again. Anyway, all I can say is, as far as we can tell, it didn't seem to have had any difference, and we stayed very strongly away from policy. That meant we had to shackle Jean Drèze at times, but we did.
Nick, hi. There's wonderful analysis, rich with stories, economic analysis.
He's been there from the beginning, I should say.
But I have one question. When you've emphasized the changing of lives, how lives have changed. Well, one aspect of changing lives is how have the length of lives changed? In other words, how has longevity changed over this 70-year period? I know it's very hard from the size of the population to construct life tables over time, but you could get some indication from the average age at death in each of these survey periods. Do you have any information on that?
We tried. Remember, it is not a birth and death survey. So it is not a birth and death survey, and especially if you've got gaps of 10 years, you miss quite a lot in that story. Although you can, if somebody's not there, you can find out whether they've moved out or died. Mostly died. But it does seem as if life expectancy has gone up. What we do try to do is to construct sort of surrogate infant mortality rates. And we do give some figures for that in chapter 11 or something. But they do seem to have gone down quite substantially. And, when we were first in Palanpur, they'd just eradicated smallpox. So there have been advances. There's very little polio there now. And there was at the beginning. There's not much polio in India. I mean, Pakistan and so on, but there's not much polio in India. So there are some important changes there that mean that life expectancy has gone up. And at least on the infant mortality side, we do try to put some surrogate numbers together. It's also true that number of children per woman has gone down quite a lot. not quite as fast as in India as a whole, but quite a lot. So the demography side of the thing is very important, and had you been with us, there'd have been more of it. But there's a fair bit there, and we can sit down and go through it.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was a wonderful account of what is an incredibly impressive story of continuing careful data collection with so much attention to quality. I've been doing something similar in Western Tamil Nadu, and what I'm curious about is the differences between what you're finding in Palanpur with what appear to be such unpromising underlying circumstances compared with what we see in Tamil Nadu. I'm curious about where your income growth is coming from, and this consistent income growth over time, and then the really quite impressive range of assets and standards of living that you're describing. And I'm just wondering if what is not coming through enough in the book and in what you're describing in these studies is the income that's coming from outside the village. There's something that I find very puzzling about. It just doesn't add up how much progress you're showing, given the circumstances that you're describing, compared with what I'm seeing in Tamil Nadu.
Yeah, I was trying to get the slides back, but anyway, at one point I had some numbers. That's beautiful.
They will here in a moment.
Oh.
Thanks, Hannah.
Oh, well done. Oh, sorry, this way. So I just want to look for the slide with the fractions of outside income. Should be here. See, that's the way in which the job structure has changed. And you can see the non-cultivation, non-farm income. This would be mostly within the village. This would be mostly outside the village. So it's played a huge part in the story. If you look back there, cultivation and livestock there is pushing 80%.
And it goes right on up to several of the next ones.
Yeah, but if you look, and we go on to the 2015, although we haven't got quite such full income data, but if you went to 2015, as I say, because that was a quicker survey, the income data is not as strong, so I haven't got it here, but that would be much higher. So I'd say if you look now, my guess is that this would be 55, 60, and this would be 15 or 20. So there's a huge change in the structure of income. And it's different kinds. I described making bricks it is horrid, but you do make a bit more. But some of them are done marble polishing. So you buy a marble polishing machine, and there you can make quite a bit more. And then the telly guy bought the mentha crusher, so he made quite a lot more. There are several shops in the village. I mean, this is shops in the Indian sense of a hole in the wall, but they weren't there before. So that's actually diversification within the village, but most of that number is diversification outside the village.
Yep.
But I'm sure that, I would guess that Tamil Nadu has moved much faster, and you can see it in the average incomes that a good bit higher. But your towns, Barbara, were in Tamil Nadu also, aren't they? Your towns were in, you looked at the changing towns in Tamil Nadu? Yeah, and you saw a similar kind of phenomena, yeah.
Barbara's going to ask the next question, but we have one here beforehand.
Yep. So my question is on the non-economic kind of like dimension or observations with regards to development. I think one of the aims of development is to kind of empower people to live the life that they value. And I wonder if...
You've been reading them, aren't you?
I wonder, what do people think about changes that happen in the village, whether there's some sense of like loss of tradition or regrets of like certain kind of like social relationship that change with development. And
yeah. On the caste side, it's strong in the sense that a higher caste would be very cautious about eating with a lower caste. There wouldn't be any intermarriage. But at the same time, you've seen the story I told about the Jatabs feeling greatly empowered in wage bargaining in a way that they weren't before. And that meant a lot to them. You know, they were exercising their own power, which, I mean, the grand order of things, it's not huge power, but it's power they didn't have before, and that came from the opportunity of the outside activity. That seems to be a very important change in people's agency, people's sense of self. A slightly depressing example, but we, in the most recent survey, collected quite a lot of data on domestic violence. And that was towards the end of 2-year stay, right? You can't ask those kind of questions if you've just arrived, and you certainly can't ask them if you're a man. And some of I say, it's a slightly depressing way to describe advance, but many of the women said that now only my husband beats me, and it's not also my mother-in-law. Now, if you want to count that as an advance, you can. It's clear that contraception is more widely used than it used to be. That's an increase in agency as well. There is quite a lot of interaction around politics across caste, which probably is much more so than it used to be before. When Mayawati was Chief Minister, there was an increase in the status and assertiveness of the Jatabs. So there is quite a lot of change, really. Is it still a society where caste is extremely important and restricts? Yes, but a bit less so. Has the status of women gone up? You know, just a little bit. And interesting to see how it's going to change with the girls going to school. With that, it'd be nice to think there's more coming than we've seen. So there's quite a lot of change in life in ways that really matter to sense of self. But we didn't survey directly on that.
Just before this lecture, up in the far north of Oxford in Kellogg College, there was a lecture by Monica Krauss, who's a teacher at the LSE, on canonical models in biological sciences and social sciences. And figuring in her lecture was the privileged research object. And I thought, well, Palanpur, thanks to your efforts, has become something of a privileged research object in development economics. So she was saying, she was singing the praises of re-surveys, revisits. And in her model of revisits, the conceptual frame was similar. The place was similar. And what was changing was time and the effect of time. And I wonder whether you could comment on that kind of an idea for the value of revisits. Because your studies of Palanpur have been in an engagement with development economics, but not just development economics, the wider field of development studies. And so I wonder what you felt about the two-way flow between development economics and development studies through your village. And instead of one place, as Judith was provoking you, you have a kind of fluid conception of place, because into the story comes money, comes migration, comes commodity trade, and none of that is confined to a single place anymore.
Yeah.
So this simple idea that revisits are really valuable because time is the one thing that varies and everything else is kept constant. I think you might have something to say about that.
I'm a little bit hazy on everything is the same except time and on what that really means. But let me try to respond with only a hazy understanding of everything is the same except time. It's certainly true that the village is no longer the self-contained unit that it might have been approximately in the 50s. You see the dominance of cultivation and livestock income there. Even in 74-5, nobody had been to Delhi. Yeah. And so there is a very big change in terms of the awareness and the importance, both the importance of and the awareness of the outside world. And that has mattered enormously. And it's driven really the story of development over the last 30 years. Increasingly, the village is a place of residence rather than a place of work. Even though people still are doing their own plots, they're much less important in their lives. So in that sense, there's a real change from a particular unit that you could think of as the anthropologist's dream of being self-contained and just to something which is a slice of India, a slice of UP. So that has changed. Everything's changed except time, though. I still could you explain that a bit more? What that means?
Well, I think time, well, she didn't say very much about this, but she said her case was the value of revisits, which was a very valuable kind of activity for social science, was keeping things constant and letting one thing vary. And the one thing that varied, obviously, was time. Okay. The observer's been fairly constant. I should have emphasised not entirely because, the effect of time, but the SS Chargi Senior conducted the first survey in 57-8 and the survey in 62-3. And we hired his younger brother, SS Chargi Jr., who looked actually quite like SS Chargi Senior. So there was a real continuity in 74-5. And Chargi stayed in touch, actually. I mean, he's a bit frail now, but he stayed in touch all the way. You came to the conference on villages that we had in JNU. Chargi was around at that time. So there's been a continuity of people. I mean, I've stuck with it since 74-5. So that continuity of people, I think, does help a bit in the sense that they know who you are and they're less bothered.
But the population of the village changes.
Yes.
People in the village change.
Yes, it's from about...
No, the actual individuals all change.
They do, but families are there. You can follow the family all the way through. Yeah, I mean, over 60 years, there's quite a lot of deaths, right? Quite a lot of births, some movement out. Yeah.
So, final question, Chris.
Given everything you've discovered about the processes in the village and that you've talked about, what do you think is the long-term trend in inequality? You've got forces that increase inequality, You've got forces that decrease it. You've got entrepreneurship, for example. You've got more migration in and out. So where is the inequality story going next in this village?
Yes. I think the story of increasing inequality, which we've seen over the last 30 years in terms of greater involvement in outside jobs, I think that's got a ways to run yet. So at some point, I think the acceleration of the catch-up and the more and more people involved in outside activity could start to bring it down again. But there's so many different kinds of opportunities now outside, and some of them worth a good deal more. So I think that story of increasing inequality, I mean, I don't know what the number is, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the next survey we found inequality has gone up a bit. But we'll see. We're thinking about, the last one was 2015, so the next one should be about 2025, something like that. We're still sort of getting over postnatal exhaustion, and but we're planning the next one, and so that speculation that inequality will go up a bit is in chapter 12. As I say, we've got some things right, and some we forecast. Christopher and I forecast in the first book that paddy would go up and outside formal jobs would go up. Paddy did go up, outside formal jobs didn't. I mean, partly because this process of moving to the informal intensified, and partly because, there are kind of biggish local activities like a paper mill closing or there's kind of cake biscuit factory that closed. So you get these kind of exogenous shocks. But I did promise to say, let me close out on climate. The water table's gone down maybe 25 foot to 40 foot or so. It's mostly been water mining. It's the great artesian well of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. So it's mostly been water mining rather than climate change, but that will start to kick in as the snows and the glaciers melt off the Himalayas, which will mean that you'll get, as it were, torrents for more of the year, and more of that water will rush out into the sea, down in Calcutta somewhere. So that will change. I suspect the water table will push down quite fast because of that. The monsoon could really change, and there's some quite good work in IISc, Bangalore, in Pune, and it's very hard to predict how it would change, but that monsoon could just collapse. And if that happened, the whole reason for agriculture in the way it is, for hundreds of millions of people, would change. And with climate change, you get very intense, much more intense rainfall over shorter periods. That could be extremely destructive to agriculture. And finally, if you look at recent work at MIT, that part of the world and northeastern China are places where 50 years from now, the wet bulb temperature, the outside temperature, could be such for quite major periods that you couldn't survive outside for more than a few hours. So it hasn't hit hard yet, but stick around. And 30, 40, 50 years now, perhaps sooner if the monsoon collapses, it could be a huge deal right across the Indo-Gangetic Plain.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking Nick, but before I do that, then two brief announcements. One is that please do join us for a drink outside and an opportunity for Nick to sign a copy of his book. Secondly, this has been a lecture.
There's 3 books. I can sign 3. They republished. They take credit cards. There's they republished the earlier 2 volumes in paperback simultaneously.
It's a reduction if you buy all 3 together.
You have to speak to our friends from. This is India. Always negotiate.
As I said, this has been part of a series on evolving economic thought. Our next one actually is on Thursday. It's a joint one with the Blavatnik School, Mariana Mazzucato, talking about the economic concept of value. I should perhaps announce another talk, which will be in 20 years' time, when we invite Nick back to actually send 4 copies of his book.
That's right. Thank you.
Nick, this has been a really fascinating talk and just wonderful to see what you've been able to do over such a long period.